welcome to the Network for Responsible Public Policy. I'm Jenny Smith-Wilson, a trustee of NFRPP. We're so happy that you've joined us tonight. The Network for Responsible Public Policy connects people with thought leaders who educate and inspire. Tonight, we're so fortunate to have with us another distinguished group of thought leaders, this time in the realm of tax policy. Kyle Pomerleau is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies federal tax policy. Bill Gale is the R.J. and Francis Miller Chair in Federal Economic Policy in the Economic Studies program at the Brookings Institute. Tonight's program will be moderated by our friend and colleague, Peter Coy, economics and finance writer for the opinion section of the New York Times. Peter has a thought-provoking newsletter that you can sign up for through the New York Times website. I recommend it. Please visit the NFRPP website to learn more about tonight's panel. It's also where you'll find our extensive library of videos of past programs and a wealth of information on relevant topics. As always, tonight's conversation will generate questions, which we welcome. Please type your questions into the Q&A box. Our panel will respond to as many as possible. Peter, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Jenny, and thanks for the plug for the newsletter. We have two great people that I've interviewed many times over the years, and they don't see eye to eye and everything, which is just fine. And we'll be able to explore areas where they agree and where they disagree. So maybe I'll start out with something that's in the news right now, which is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was the signature achievement, and certainly in the economic realm, of President Trump's term in office. And parts of it are coming up for extension or will expire. So I'd like to get both speakers to talk a little bit about TCJA, the pros and cons of that act, and the pros and cons of a full extension. So maybe I'll start with Kyle. Kyle, why don't you take that one?
Sure. So maybe just a little bit of background first on the major components of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was a pretty significant piece of legislation. It changed individual income taxes, corporate income taxes, and estate and gift taxes. And it changed more than just tax rates. It also made pretty big alterations to the tax base and impacted most tax filers in the United States. On the individual side, it reduced statutory tax rates. It reformed family tax benefits, such as what we call the standard deduction and the personal exemption and the child tax credit. It scaled back the alternative minimum tax, a parallel tax that people, usually high-income households, have to contend with. And then it also limited some itemized deductions. These are deductions people can take for expenses such as state and local taxes, the home mortgage interest, and charitable. It also introduced a new deduction for business income, a 20% deduction that people in Washington call the Section 199 Cap A. For businesses or corporations, the centerpiece was a very large reduction in the corporate income tax from 35% to 21%. It also made changes to the tax base of the corporate income tax, in some places improving the tax treatment of certain investments, while in other places worsening the tax treatment of certain investments, and also reforming the tax treatment of multinational corporations. These are businesses that earn profits both here and abroad. And then lastly, it scaled back the estate tax by raising the exemption and drastically reducing the number of households that are potentially subject to it. So some pros and some cons of the law quickly here. So, up front, it was a pretty significant reduction in federal revenue. At the time of passage, that wasn't as much of a concern. Interest rates were low. The capacity for borrowing for the United States was pretty high. But in the meantime, or since post-COVID, interest rates have risen quite a bit. debt has continued to get worse and worse. So we're really starting to feel that loss of revenue that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act had pushed through. So the pros is that I think a lot of the reforms it made to the corporate income tax were needed. The United States, prior to the passage of the TCJA, was sort of an outlier in how it taxed its multinational corporations, and that created a number of problems, such as incentives to shift profits, headquarters, and highly mobile assets overseas, harming both the tax base and potentially the U.S. economy. And then I'll just, I guess, cap off with one more con here is that and as you'd implied, majority of the tax cuts were passed and they were temporary. They are set to expire at the end of next year, and lawmakers are going to need to take that issue up. Otherwise, roughly 85 to 90% of households will face some sort of tax increase due to that change. And I'll kick it over to Bill, and maybe he can talk about some of the pros and cons of extension.
Thanks. You should all know that was an incredible summary of TCJA. I want to add a few things. First, the tax cut had some antecedents and ideas from both Republicans and Democrats in the earlier 5 years. But when it was brought into Congress and enacted, it was enacted on a strictly partisan basis. So you would have thought that when the Democrats took control of both houses in the White House in 2021, they would have reconsidered or repealed some of the provisions. They did not. They did not touch any major provision of the Tax Act. So that's an interesting, I think, prelude for what we're looking at coming up the next couple of years. The provisions that expire in 2025 all have to do with the individual income tax. The corporate income tax rules were made permanent. So the issue was the individual side and the estate tax, not the corporate tax cuts. From kind of a 30,000-foot view of the economy, you don't see marks of TCJA in sort of GDP growth or aggregate investment. Where you see the big first order effects are in the deficit, as Kyle mentioned, and in the distribution of income. The tax cut made the distribution of income less equal. It gave bigger proportional and much bigger absolute tax cuts to most high-income people than to low-income people. There's one exception to that, which is that the limitation on state and local deductions actually hit some high-income people. So high-income groups had the biggest proportional absolute tax cuts, but they also had the biggest share of people that had tax increases, oddly enough. So the debate shouldn't be limited to the individual income tax. There's no reason not to reconsider the corporate provisions, given how large they were. I don't think the international provisions are going to change. Well, let's take it back. I think that corporate provisions should be on the table, but also the debate in 2025 shouldn't just be about, do we extend these provisions and not that provisions, or do we extend all the provisions, or do we extend none of the provisions? There's a wealth of tax issues beyond just what we do with TCJA.
Okay, great. You both did a fantastic job of explaining a complicated, sprawling act. I want to focus in on the supply side aspect, since Bill, you raised that a little bit. You said that you didn't see much evidence in the macroeconomy for supply side benefits of the tax cuts. In other words, it didn't cause businesses to do more investment and growth. And I want to ask you to talk about that just a little bit more. And then I want to ask Justin to come back with his views on whether, Kyle to come back with his views on the supply side or the lack of supply side effects.
Sure. The tax cut was motivated by supply side concerns, by business competitiveness, by growth via investment from both corporations and other companies. If you look, typically we divide investment or non-residential investment into three categories: equipment, structures, and intellectual property. A very brief summary is equipment and structure investments got the biggest tax cuts, but as a share of GDP, they didn't change much at all after 2017. IP got a smaller tax cut, but it had been growing before TCJA and it kept growing afterwards. So when I say there's not kind of a first order footprint in the macro data, that's what I mean. There are micro studies that are more positive than the macro evidence that find evidence of higher investment in corporations versus other businesses, or higher investment in corporations overall. I think the jury is still out on them, but there's an interesting tension between the macro evidence and the micro evidence.
Kyle, your thoughts?
Yeah, and I'll pick up right from there. The macro evidence, I think, is as Bill said, it's mixed at best. And my view on the macro stuff is that at the end of the day, it's pretty messy. You're talking about economic aggregates that, investment especially is a pretty volatile series in the national income and product accounts. It can bounce around for all sorts of reasons that have little to do with, say, fiscal policy year to year. But that's not to say that, that we should see this large effect. And there's also an issue of theory and timing on some of the supply side stuff. So I think when lawmakers or policy analysts talk about the effects of tax policy, there's a tendency to kind of blur the line between, say, supply side effects, which are changes in incentives that encourage or discourage certain behaviors. So if I reduce the cost of a new investment, I'm going to do that a little bit more. Or if I increase the cost of going to work by raising marginal tax rates, I might work a little bit less. Or the demand side stuff, where you increase after-tax income, that increases spending, and that encourages the economy to pick up a little bit, at least temporarily. Now, when we think about the demand side stuff, it's usually timed relatively well with the actual policy. So you cut taxes, people may respond within a couple of quarters to the increase in after-tax income, and that will last and perhaps be noticeable in macroeconomic sense. The supply side stuff, it's less clear exactly how long that stuff is supposed to take, because ultimately what the law is trying to do is investment is just a means to an end. Companies are going to invest more in order to produce or to create a larger stock of capital that then they're going to use along with their workers to produce more goods and services. Question is, how long does it take to build up that larger capital stock and then produce those goods and services? And I'm not entirely convinced that 1819 is a perfectly good window to view that. And then we have the additional challenge of, once we get into 2020, we're talking about a global pandemic. And then anyway, there's no real way you're going to be able to tease out from the data exactly what the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did compared to a pandemic, compared to extraordinarily accommodative Federal Reserve policy and fiscal policy through the CARES Act, et cetera, et cetera. So we're very limited to those 2 years, but which is unfortunate because the supply side stuff may take a little bit longer. But I do think there is promise in these micro studies, as Bill said, and we probably won't get into them because they're pretty technical, but I think the debate will be over those studies in the long run.
Okay, I just want to remind people that we invite questions. Please enter your question in the question and answer box in Zoom, and I will go through them and pick out the best ones and present them to the two panelists. So AEI is considered a center-right think tank, and Brookings considered maybe center-left. So you would never guess that from listening to the two of you talk, because so far we haven't really seen much daylight between the two of you. Is there an issue where we would start to get more of a sense of where you don't come down on the same side of an issue? Are there particular tax, for example? I don't know whether it be something to do with Social Security taxation or the child tax credit, or how you stand on value-added taxes. There's so many different issues we could look at. Is there one that would be a good topic to sort of feel you out on taking different positions?
So I always joke that if you want, so Bill, I think, is a great person that knows tax policy very well. And if I wanted the federal government to raise a lot more revenue and do it in a very efficient way, I would have Bill design the tax system, because I think Bill and I both agree a lot on maybe some underlying structural components of taxation. We may disagree on maybe the size and scope of government overall. That's one area there's potential disagreement. There may be disagreement also about the distribution of the tax burden. What is ideal? I mean, I'm not even good at answering that question myself. But yeah, I think those may be some broader areas where there may be disagreement.
I mean, I think that's right. I think I greatly respect Kyle, and we've actually worked together, and we are working together because we like the way each of us, the other one, thinks. But yeah, I think Kyle, I think I would probably like a bigger government than Kyle would, and not just because, not just a big government. I would like the government to invest its resources to a greater extent than Kyle would, and the distributional issues. Yeah, so it doesn't sound, those sound like technical issues, but we're talking about how much revenue the government raises and who should pay it, right? Those are pretty fundamental issues. But on the spectrum of things, you're right. Center left and center right leaves a whole lot of room. And we're at alphabet, we're probably K to P or something like that, rather than A to Z.
Right.
Okay.
And if I think you surveyed a lot of the tax literature, I think a lot of this stuff has been written about for years and years and years. And there's basically nothing new under the sun in terms of tax. And, because of that, I think we're limited to debating, maybe these more fundamental issues such as size and scope of government or distribution that are, not, hard to answer in any technical sense. They're more, I think, ultimately political, philosophical, rather than like, what's the best way to tax, a certain type of transaction, for example. That's been written about, and I think there's a lot of agreement in the tax world about that.
We have a question here from Michael James. He says the CBO estimated that extending Trump's tax cut would add $3.5 trillion to the deficit, and yet Republicans always seem to run campaigns on a runaway deficit. What is the end game here, and is this a longer-term goal of cutting into Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera?
I could talk about the size of the extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is going to be pretty significant. So the CBO estimated at least the most of the individual provisions and a handful of the business provisions would cost about $3.5 trillion to extend. If you were to then broaden that to all of the provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and look at a full 10 years, it's maybe closer to $4 trillion over a decade. We've already discussed, I think, the downsides of simply extending all of those provisions. That creates a pretty big fiscal imbalance over and above what we already have. And then the second issue about maybe political rhetoric. My view is that deficit concerns are, at least in the past, have been typically used as a bludgeon by one party or the other on their opponents. Ultimately, I think Republicans want to see lower taxes, but also lower spending, where Democrats want to see higher taxes and higher spending. And that's where the fundamental disagreements are. I think complaining about the deficit is more political rhetoric. Now, I know that there are a lot of people in Washington, including myself, that actually have legitimate concerns about the fiscal balance of the federal government. But in terms of lawmakers and rhetoric, I don't take it too seriously when they talk about the deficit.
Bill, any thoughts?
Unfortunately, I don't take it too seriously when they talk about the deficit either. The deficit reduction is everyone's second choice, and everyone obviously goes for their first choice. I totally agree about the talking point stuff. I wrote a book on fiscal policy about 5 years ago, and there's a couple of quotes in there from people saying, "Oh yeah, saying very directly, congressmen or congress members saying, yeah, that was just a talking point."
Well, then, but let me ask you though, on the substance, how worried should we be about big federal budget deficits and mounting federal debt?
There's a couple of, obviously this is a huge problem in the long term. I think there's a tendency of people who want policymakers to focus on this, to try to catastrophize the solution, that we're going to have a crisis, we're going to be like Argentina, etc. And I don't think that that's productive, because it's not, we're not Argentina. We issue the world's currency. In 2008, we literally exported a financial crisis to the rest of the world, and they sent us money because we were a safe place to invest. So we have this long-term gradual issue, and it's still a problem. It's still, you're talking about a rising government borrowing needs with shrinking world supply of saving. And that's reflecting itself in interest rates, but it's still a problem, but it's not a crisis. And being honest about the problem makes it even harder for politicians to focus on it, because if it's a crisis, maybe they'll focus on it, but if it's just a gradual thing, they'll put it off. And I will add, the American public is not helping solve this problem. You can get people to say anything you want in polls, but it's a pretty consistent result in polls that people don't want tax increases and they don't want spending cuts, but they do want the deficit to go down. And so, there's this disconnect, and to expect policymakers to make tough choices when the public is not calling for them to do that is unrealistic, unfortunately.
Yeah. You want to add anything on that, Kyle?
No, I'll leave it there.
Okay, good. So I got a question here from Robert Chaikis. I don't know how to pronounce it. Do you agree that very wealthy individuals, for several reasons, don't pay their fair share of taxes? And what can be done to correct that situation? For example, would it hurt Elon Musk to pay another 1% in tax to help the rest of society? And let me just combine that with the next question, which is somewhat related. Do you, Lee Chinitz, do you have any thoughts on the concept of a wealth tax?
I can take this, or at least take the first crack at this. So just a couple points in terms of just fair share. I mean, the first one is that fair share as a concept is not well defined. So my fair share is going to be different than your fair share, Peter, or Bill's fair share. So that I think ultimately will be a political question. Voters, lawmakers will decide how much high income households need to pay versus low income households. Second point is, with some caveats, and I'll get to those, the tax system or the federal tax system in the United States is progressive. So what this means is that low-income households are paying a lower share of their income than high-income households. So according to some recent CBO data, the effective tax rate of, say, the bottom quintile, and this was in 2019 prior to the pandemic. So the data is a little old, but probably better reflective of a normal economy. The effective tax rate of the bottom income group was 0.5% on average, whereas the top 1% were paying around roughly 30% of their income in taxes. So that's a pretty progressive structure. Now, there are caveats to that not all taxes that the federal government levies are progressive. The income tax is very progressive. The corporate income tax is progressive, but the payroll tax and excise taxes are roughly flat or regressive. And also, another caveat is that at the very, very tippy top, again, talking about our Elon Musks or Jeff Bezos's, their effective tax rates are slightly lower than, say, the average of the top 1% because of the nature of their income. They have a lot of their income that they earned is in the gains from on stock and ownership of their own company. And besides the corporate tax, their income tax is basically deferred. They don't have to immediately pay income tax like individuals do. So that brings their effective tax rate down. And then the last question, or the second question here, which is, would I consider, do I like a wealth tax? My answer is no. I think that would be a poor way to raise revenue in general. I think it has a lot of administrative and economic issues, and there are better ways and more direct ways to reform income taxation to make the tax code more progressive than enacting a federal wealth tax.
Great. So just a couple of things. First, I want to distinguish between tax evasion and tax avoidance. Tax evasion is illegally not paying your taxes. Tax avoidance is legally reducing your tax burden. There's some issue about evasion at the very top, the top 1%. And the Inflation Reduction Act bill a couple of years ago has funding in it for the IRS to basically step up its auditing of very affluent households, and that auditing rate has fallen a lot over time. So that I'm very much in favor of that. I think people should pay the taxes that they owe. The question is probably more about tax avoidance, which, as Kyle mentioned, because the very wealthy people, the Bezoses and the Gates and the Musks and so on, have so much of their wealth tied up in stocks, they don't have to pay any taxes on that until they actually sell the stock. And you might think, well, they need to sell some of the stock to maintain their living standards. And the answer is they don't. There's a strategy called buy, borrow, die, which is you put your assets up as collateral, you borrow money against that, you pay that back, and then when you die, there's something called basis step up. So if you bought your stock at $1 and it's worth 10,000 when you die, if you had sold it the day before, you would have to pay tax on $9,999 of capital gains. But if you hold it till you die, your heirs inherit it, and the government then gives them the new purchase price of 10,000. So the capital gains on that $9,999 is never subject to income tax. So that is I think it's fair to say the biggest loophole in the tax system, and I would like to see us close that. Now the question is how. The most extreme version would be to tax capital gains as they accrue every year. And I don't think we have the capability to do that without, I mean, we could do that for a whole bunch of people's stocks, but it would be quite complicated. And I think a stepping stone toward this would be either not to step up the basis at death, the way I talked about, or actually tax the capital gain at death. The argument there would be that you sort of need to close the books during your, each generation closes the books during its life. The other thing we could do that I think would help would be to convert the estate tax to an inheritance tax. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the estate tax. It only affects, for example, a few, 2 or 3 households per 1,000 deaths. But there's a case that people built up all this wealth during their life. It may not be the smartest thing to tax it at the end. Whereas an inheritance tax, it's hard to argue. Let's put it this way. If you look at the Hilton family, okay, Conrad Hilton generated all this wealth, that's well and good. It's hard to argue that Paris Hilton deserves every dollar of that, and that we shouldn't tax that inheritance. That's a form of income, like any other form of income, and it could be taxed either separately or as part of the income tax. In fact, we had an income tax in the 1890s that got ruled unconstitutional, which led to the 16th Amendment and the current income tax. But that income tax in the 1890s had inheritance in it as part of the base, as a historical footnote. So it's not a crazy idea to tax inheritance as part of income, and I think it would have a lot of advantages.
Very interesting. Kyle, how do you feel about that?
The inherited taxing inheritance or taxing
Yeah.
estates. So I tend to be more negative on taxing estates or inheritances in general. So one way you can view these taxes, and I think they're different. They're fundamentally different than, say, income taxes. So income taxes, you're either working or you're investing and you're generating income, and that is being taxed as you generate it. And then you put money aside, and that money accumulates over time, whether it's taxing, the legal incidents, whether it's on the estate or it's on the inheritor through the inheritance tax, you're still going to then tax that again at the very end. So there's a built-in disincentive to save. Now, under current law, it's very, very small because, as Bill said, the estate tax barely touches anyone, but broadening that would worsen that incentive to some degree. And I think the purpose of the inheritance tax is to avoid this, but so this critique is more about the estate tax, is that the estate tax itself is as it stands, a very inefficient source of revenue for the amount it raises from those households that it applies to. That places a large cost, both administratively on the IRS to enforce it, but also on the private sector, because there's a lot of ways, at least under current law, that individuals can avoid such a tax. And even if you were to close those, the most obvious way to avoid the estate or inheritance tax is to consume your income, before you die. And that's not necessarily a great incentive, in my opinion. I don't think the tax code should be penalizing thrift to that degree. But again, it all depends on the ultimate structure of the tax. If it's a very significant tax with a very high rate, the disincentive effects are stronger than if it were, say, the rates were lower and it was maybe built into the individual income tax.
Okay. One big issue in social policy is the so-called benefit cliff, and I'll just spend a minute explaining it to the audience, which is that you get a benefit, and it could be a payment or it could be a tax credit of some kind, but it phases out as you go up in income. And so it becomes a disincentive to earn money, because as you earn money, a big portion of it is taken back from you because the benefits are phasing out. So one thought is to eliminate that problem by just not phasing things out. And that's sort of the idea of a universal basic income that goes to everybody, even Bill Gates. But that's costly because you're spending money for people who don't need it. Are there other ways that we can help the poor and not spend a lot of money, and yet not provide disincentives to work and make income?
Um,
The
I,
short
I,
answer is no.
The answer is no.
You either don't give a benefit, or you make it universal, or you phase it out, right?
Right.
And I think there's something to be said for the universal basic income. I wrote a paper a couple years ago about creating a value-added tax that was combined with part of it being used to finance a universal basic income. It's a very progressive option because the value added, if you think of value added tax as a consumption tax, which is what it is, think of it as like a 10% tax on consumption. That's going to rise with people's affluence, whereas a universal basic income is constant, so it offsets a much greater share, in fact, more than 100% of the tax at the lowest levels, and a decreasing percentage of that tax as income goes up. That has all the advantages of an efficient tax, because consumption taxes don't distort saving and investment choices, and it has the advantage of a progressive redistribution of resources. So I actually like the universal basic income. Most economists, I think, don't, because they're worried about negative labor supply effects. But I think the evidence suggests that those would not be that big. But this might be an area where Kyle and I disagree.
But before we turn it over to Kyle, Bill, could you explain the last part about why you don't see negative labor income effects?
About why you don't?
Yeah.
I mean, the basically, if you give people, this applies to the inheritance tax too. Generally, the idea is if you give people income, they're going to consume more and work less. And just so people are concerned, if you have a universal basic income that goes to everybody, that people would choose to work less. There have been a number of experiments, or quasi experimental, social experiments that suggest that effect for UBIs would be small, but it's
Is there a
hard.
reason why? Can you explain why that would be a small effect, since it goes
Basically, the universal basic income, it wouldn't have to be that big. If you gave everybody 30,000 a year, I think you would expect a massive decline in labor supply. But we're talking about, $500 a month, $6,000 a year. That's not enough to live on, but it's enough to kind of keep, to help somebody weather the emergencies and stuff like that, and get some basic needs met. I mean, it's the B is important. It's meant to be universal basic income, not make everybody middle class or something like that. But yeah, so that's the concern. But I think, again, if I would guess the labor supply effect depends massively on how big the basic income benefit is.
Kyle?
Yeah, 2 points here. So first one, so Peter, you talked about how there's this trade-off between you have a social policy with a phase out that might have distorting features, but it costs less, and then say a UBI that's it's very generous. It costs a lot, but you get rid of those phase out structures. Just make the case here that those two, once you incorporate the taxes needed to finance spending, those two policies are not very different at the end of the day. You can think of a policy that transfers money but phases out as income as the same as a universal benefit with a tax, because the tax applies as your income goes up. It's roughly the same as phasing out the benefit. So you can't really avoid that distortion. And this I think is important in the UBI discussion, that whether it's a value added tax or an income tax, to finance the UBI, you're still ultimately going to have some sort of distortionary impact because of the taxes required to finance it. Now, and then the point about the UBI and work incentives, actually, I might surprise Bill by saying that I agree with you. I think ultimately, what determines someone's work incentive is the after-tax returns to work, what economists like to call the substitution effect. So deciding whether to work or not is based on this trade-off of whether you value spending time at home, leisure at home, versus the after-tax value of going into the workforce. And that trade-off there is what influences work incentives. That's why we think of the income tax as distorting work decisions, because it applies to one of those, but not the other. The UBI, of course, is neutral. You get it whether you stay at home or you get it whether you work. So there's no distortion there. What you're only left with is the income effect, which what was Bill was talking about. And a lot of the literature says that the income effect is vanishingly small and roughly nil. And then once you incorporate the taxes necessary to finance a UBI, there is no income effect at the end of the day, because while you are giving to people on one hand, you're then taking away from people on the other, and that the net income effect of the total economy for a revenue neutral UBI, for a VAT, for example, is zero. There is no income effect. So all you're left with is the distortionary effect of taxes.
Okay. I'm going to go to questions from the audience. I'm going to start with the last one because Pepita Soto said I need to leave soon, but I'm loving the conversation. Will this webinar be available on your website? And I think Rhoda would say yes. Is that right, Rhoda? She's not on right now, but I think I can say, Steve, Jenny, that is correct. This will be posted on the website. So I'm going to go to some more questions. Bernard O'Brien says, my understanding is that federal excise taxes on alcohol have not been adjusted for inflation since the early 1990s, thereby costing federal treasury billions in revenue. Any thoughts on that?
That's certainly true. A lot of excise taxes are not levied in proportion to price. Rather, they're levied in terms of dollars or cents per some sort of unit. Alcohol taxes are one of those. The federal excise tax on gasoline and diesel is another one of those. And as the price level rises, but those nominal figures for tax rates stay the same, that means a declining real revenues from that revenue source. And I think the question of what to do with those taxes, one, should be informed by what inflation has done, but also what the proper level of those taxes should be. So a lot of those taxes, gas taxes, alcohol taxes, they're either levied as prices for certain things. So for example, the gas tax is used to fund the highway trust fund. The trust fund then finances road construction, highway construction. The gas tax is viewed as kind of a price for driving. And the tax rate on an excise tax should be determined based on what we think that price should be. My personal view is the excise tax on gasoline is far too low, even after adjusting it for inflation to go back to where it was back in 1993, because I think the cost of each additional driver is pretty high on society, especially on roads, and in terms of congestion. Alcohol taxes are a slightly different question. That's kind of what you call your traditional sin tax, and the justification there could be that because alcohol has negative effects on your health, the federal government has a place to come in and tax that in order to reduce that sort of behavior. There's also an externality argument for alcohol, that alcohol puts alcohol consumption, or a significant amount of alcohol consumption, puts burden on the healthcare system, and that should be priced to some degree. I'm less convinced by the alcohol tax arguments than I am for the gas tax arguments, but there is a case, to raise those taxes outside of just issues of inflation.
Okay. Bill, before you go, I just want to say I got a note from Stephen Summers saying that indeed this will be posted on the website in a few days. It'll take a few days to process, but then you can find it there. Bill, you can answer that one or not. I have other questions, so I can move on if you'd like.
Let's move on.
Okay, so next
I
question.
I agree with everything Kyle said about the excise taxes.
Okay. This is from Anonymous. Many politicians, writers, and commentators liken the federal deficit to running a household. Voters seem to accept that parallel. How valid is it? I think the question is more about the federal government to running a household. And I guess this gets back to the idea is it appropriate for the federal government to run a deficit during a recession? Maybe I'll rephrase a little bit like that.
There are similarities, but there are very important differences. The federal government is infinitely live. The federal government prints its own money. You know, that's very different from a household. The federal government is kind of the lender and the spender, if you will, of last resort in recessions. So those are all different. Where there's similarity is that you can't just look at the debt that the government has or a household has. You have to look at what the entity is doing with the debt. So there's sort of good debt and bad debt. A household that finances a vacation on a credit card, you know, is probably not being very somber financially. On the other hand, a household that takes out a mortgage or takes out a loan to start a business, that might be thought of as good debt, as debt that's furthering some investment goal. And the same thing is true with the government. If people were comfortable with the way the government was spending the money, the government was borrowing and investing in high return efforts, there would be less concern about the deficit because the future interest costs, the future repayment costs would be matched by future dividends to the economy. So a lot of the real concern about we tend to focus on the deficit or the debt, but a lot of real concern is on the other side of the ledger, or what the government's doing with it. And that's where the increasing spending on entitlements comes in as a concern. And so there are parallels, but the notion here's where the parallel really breaks down is when people say the government should run a balanced budget. That's what households do, and it's not quite right. If households had to run a balanced budget the way that people who propose balanced budget amendments want the federal government to run a balanced budget, households would not be able to take out mortgages. They would not be able to take out car loans. They would not be able to take out student loans, etc. So the analogy can be pushed too far, and it is pushed too far often.
Well, I'll just jump in here and say that the other problem with the analogy is that when consumers stop spending, somebody else has to come in and spend to sustain demand, or you have the Keynes's paradox of thrift. The economy spirals downward. But Kyle, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that was the point I was going to make, that I think there's political rhetoric around this idea that if the economy is doing poorly and income to the government is going down, meaning that tax revenues are going down because GDP is contracting due to a recession, that the government needs to pull back. But generally, we think of this the other way at the federal level, because there is, I think, a benefit to the government providing stimulus when the economy is in recession. As you said, that when there's a shortfall in aggregate demand or demand for goods and services, that's going to put people out of work. That's going to sideline some factories and some machines, and that additional spending, additional money in the hands of households, that's going to boost spending, and that may bring those bring the people and machines back into the labor force or back online, and can have a real and positive economic effect. It would be, I think, bad if the government were to do the opposite when nominal incomes were already falling in the economy.
Okay, good. Now I'm sort of aiming to wrap this by about 8:30 if possible. So I'm hoping that people will get their questions in now. we got a couple about progressivity, which we've covered a little bit already. So I think what I'd rather do is ask this question from anonymous attendee, which I think is we haven't covered at all, which is an import tax, also known as a tariff. And what are the pros and cons of that? Let's say a big old tariff on imports from China, which is something Donald Trump's talked about. Thoughts on that?
So so I think trade policy in general, but tariffs have become a lot more popular since 2016. No coincidence. That's when Donald Trump won the election, and that has been very central to his previous campaign, but also his campaign now. His argument in favor of tariffs is he believes that because the United States is running a trade deficit meaning that we are importing more than we are exporting, that other countries are, quote, taking advantage of us. He's viewing it very much as as almost like business transactions, that if I'm buying more from you than you are buying from me, then I am not making money, or I am losing money. Now, that's not how global economics works, and I disagree with that. But his solution, or one of his solutions to that, is to enact a tariff. Now, in terms of pros and cons here, I mean, the cons are pretty straightforward. You're placing an excise tax on either selective goods or services, or a whole broad range of goods and services, and that's going to have a negative impact on the economy. And that's generally going to reduce output in the United States. The reason that's the case is that you are raising taxes on a lot of consumer goods. It's acting like a sales tax. But you're also raising taxes on a lot of inputs that go into the production processes in the United States. And so counterintuitively, and we don't have to get into this, that generally what economists think happens when you raise taxes on imports is that exports will also fall as well, because economists view trade as a two-way street, in that if imports fall, then exports at some point also have to fall. The arguments in favor of tariffs, which I personally find pretty weak, center around, I think, more of national defense or political economy arguments, that politicians want to put more political pressure on China or other countries to change their behaviors in ways they think would be beneficial to the rest of the economy. There's been a lot of accusations that China is greatly subsidizing certain industries to harm those industries in the United States or elsewhere. So lawmakers want to put tariffs on a whole host of goods in order to protect those industries in the United States.
So this is one of these tortured issues where economists are in very strong agreement, but have a hard time convincing the public of this. Alan Blinder, a Princeton economist, once said that economists are most ignored on the issues where they are most in agreement. And I just thought that was a brilliant quote. But tariffs, let's be clear. If you put a tariff on import, you're raising costs for American businesses. You're raising costs for American consumers. You will not reduce the trade deficit that way, because if you take a step back, think about how much we save domestically and how much we invest domestically. If we save less than we invest, then we have to finance the rest of that investment from the rest of the world. All right, that's a capital inflow. If there's a capital inflow, the only way to pay for that is with a trade deficit. And if you don't change saving and investment, you're not going to change the trade deficit. So if imports go down, exports have to go down. And ironically, TCJA, the 2017 tax cut that Trump championed, was meant to work by increasing investment. Right. And that's going to increase the difference between saving and investment, increase the capital inflow, and therefore increase the trade deficit. So it's quite a hard to explain issue, but it's simply a bad idea to try to solve well, it's not clear the trade deficit is a problem to begin with. Okay, you run a trade deficit with your grocery store every week, right? You buy stuff from them, they don't buy stuff from you, but that's fine. That's that's a bilateral trade deficit, but you're better off for having been able to buy food at the grocery store. So it's not clear if bilateral trade deficits are an issue at all, and it's certainly not the case that a tariff is going to solve the problem. And ironically, the 2017 tax cut may well have made the trade deficit problem worse.
Yeah, and in terms of policies that could address the trade deficit, yeah, Bill hinted at those strongly. One would be policies that increase domestic saving to some degree, whether that's private saving or government saving, and that would be a reduction of the budget deficit.
Right. Okay. Well, I want to wrap it here, but I think I'm going to try to sneak in one last question, and it comes again from Anonymous. I don't know if this is the same anonymous person. I wish he or she would let us know who he or she is, because these are good questions. What additional demand can the government create should we enter a recession? The person adds their record backlogs of shovel-ready jobs at this time. I guess another way to expanding on that question would be to say, is this like are we in a bad position if the economy suddenly slumped and we had a recession now?
We had a very interesting experiment along these lines with COVID, which was the only recession ever where personal income went up. And personal income went up because the government provided so much stimulus. And you can argue about whether the structure of the stimulus packages were well done or not. But certainly in situations like for children, the stimulus both had a big effect and helped get a lot of families with children out of poverty, at least on a temporary basis. So, I mean, the government can do more countercyclical policy again if it needs to. There's also an argument that the countercyclical measures should be built in so that they happen, so that you don't need more legislation to get them done.
Yeah.
And just at a general matter here, when the economy currently is running, pretty hot, where we've been at least for a while dealing with inflation. If the government were to stimulate from here, yes, there wouldn't be jobs to bring off that people coming off the sidelines. What really would be happening is you'd be pushing up prices and you'd get more inflation. But that's not the case during a recession. During a recession, the economy looks different. There are people that are unemployed that previously were employed that you could bring back into the labor force.
Okay, guys, I think I'm going to end it there. I want to thank Kyle Pomerleau and Bill Gale, and I'm going to turn it over now to Jenny.
And I'm going to also thank Bill and Kyle and also Peter for another wonderful discussion from the Network for Responsible Public Policy. Our next NFRPP program will be on Thursday, May 23rd at 7:30. The topic will be Identity in Urban-Rural Political Division, Consequences and Solutions. Please plan to join us. Watch your email for a brief survey on tonight's program. We do use your input to help shape future programs. Thank you all and see you on May 23rd. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Right.